Next on the agenda is a panel of speakers who will be discussing pediatric clinical trials, a very important topic. I'd like to invite Dr. Hilary Jerico, the panel moderator, up to the stage. Dr. Jerico is an assistant professor of pediatrics and the director for pediatric clinical research for the Celiac Disease Center at the University of Chicago.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. This has been an excellent summit and very exciting, as Jocelyn Sylvester said earlier, to be moving back towards in-person events as opposed to everything being virtual. So this portion of the summit today will focus, as Kate said, on pediatric clinical trials in celiac disease. It'll open up with two short presentations by Dr. Alessio Fasano and Dr. Shayna Coburn, and then it will follow that up with a question and answer session. Included in the panel will be two of our patient representatives, Jaime Lipson and her son, Aden Lipson. So what I will do now briefly, we're going to actually have all members of the panel come up and sit at the table now, and then afterwards I will turn the microphone over to either Dr. Fasano or Dr. Coburn, whoever will be speaking first. So if the panel members want to come up, and then I'll give brief introductions, and then I'll turn over the microphone. Yes, that would be perfect. Thank you. All right, so I'll make my way down the panelists here just to give brief introductions. So first on our panel here is Dr. Alessio Fasano, who probably needs no introduction at all, but he is the Chief of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Mass General Hospital for Children. He is the Director of the Center for Celiac Research, as well as the Director of Mucosal Immunology and the Biology Research Center. Next to him is Aden Lipson and his mother, Jaime Lipson. They are our two patient representatives today. Jaime was diagnosed with celiac disease over 20 years ago, and Aden was diagnosed as a child. Jaime has also been a long-term Beyond Celiac volunteer and a Reach Beyond Celiac ambassador. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shayna Coburn. She is a licensed psychologist in the Division of Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition at Children's National Hospital. She is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, and it also oversees the psychosocial services and their celiac disease program. I'll turn over the microphone to Dr. Fasano, and then Dr. Coburn will follow up with their presentations on pediatric clinical trials in celiac disease. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So again, thank you for having me, and I put, the 10 slides, 10 minutes, that's the rule, based on the imposition from Emmy, what I need to talk about. So, and again, I put this, also in a perspective, timeline, so that you understand how we got to this, point in which we can even consider clinical trial in pediatrics. It was unconceivable until recent past. And first of all, we have been always overlooked when it comes to treatment, complementary, alternative gluten-free diet, because the general sense is you don't need it. Gluten-free is efficacious, works, safe. Why you need anything else? And therefore, all the stakeholders that could eventually be supporting this notion, NIH, industry, the Food and Drug Administration, and so on and so forth, have been always, not considered this as a priority. And also because, and I remember vividly because I was there, I said, this is not a big deal disease. You don't die like cancer. And I said, with all respect, sir, there are different ways to die. You die fast of cancer, and you can die very slowly of celiac disease. Which one you want, if you have to choose one. But anyhow, so what are the pros and cons of the gluten-free diet, and why we definitely need alternative complementary, strategies even in pediatrics. Of course, efficacy was indeed believed to be pretty much 100%. That's not the case. You heard many folks before me that's not been put in question. It is definitely safe. There's no side effects, but socially isolating and difficult. Not impossible, but definitely, I believe that it's not a walk in the park. You don't take drugs, so it's not pharmacological, but because of that, the cost, the adjunctive costs of gluten-free diet are not covered, so it's all out of the pocket. You can't negotiate with your health insurance. Of course, you take care of it by yourself. It's self-prescribed. You don't need to go to a healthcare professional to be prescribed the treatment, but that means that the medical support, at least until the recent past, has been minimal, to say the least. And of course, there is poor regulation. It is the treatment. It is the treatment of celiac disease, one of a kind in all autoimmune diseases. We don't have a luxury like this for MS or RA or of type 1 diabetes. But literally, because we are convinced that this is it, that we don't have alternatives. It's definitely life-saving, but the high burden of treatment is undisputable for who, and we'll hear more, live this firsthand. In 2015, there was a change of heart from the Food and Drug Administration that for the first time asked input in these meetings that they call GRADE, these acronyms for gastroenterology, regular endpoints, and advancing therapeutics, to include also celiac disease. And the goal was to discuss the appropriate target population, pharmacological therapy, blah, blah, blah. You can read that. So that was the goal in 2015. Why, again, this was accepted? Because finally, people, they realized that, there is this has been said already, that not a negligible number of people with celiac disease going on a strict gluten-free diet, not cheating, doing this right, they do not respond, either clinically and or histopathologically. And I'm not talking about the refractory that is extremely rare. To give again a number, 1,000 people with celiac disease go on a gluten-free diet, 800 will respond to gluten-free diet, 200 do not. Of these 200, 190 are non-responsive. The ones that inadvertently are exposed to cross-contamination, they are exclusively sensitive to the threshold, the gluten. The other 10, 9 of 10 will be type 1, and 1 out of 10 will be type 2 refractory celiac disease. So we are not talking about the rarity. We're talking about a sizable number of people that would not respond. And, more than 40% of adults, even after long years, they have this persistent enteropathy, and we don't know what that means in terms of morbidity and mortality, other than indirect data suggests to have a chronic inflammatory intestine is not a good thing, period. And that's intuitive. Even more scary is that we have similar situation in the pediatric population. The fact that it is less in terms of percentage doesn't mean that this is less of an issue. Actually, if anything, is more than an issue because we're talking about the lifespan expectancy that is pretty long in a growing body. This body is still growing in pediatrics. And you see that, again, this is something that was published now a while ago, the age of persistent villi atrophy, it's really increasing over time. So this is an issue that's not going away. So one of the most challenging issues is the proper compliance then, because it's the general exception is you are a master when you have control of the gluten-free diet because you cook home and so on and so forth. Then you travel, then you go on sleepover, then you go on vacation, you go to college. Now you're at the mercy of the others to understand the stringency, how your gluten-free diet needs to be implemented. And, these are, the issues that the adult population face, but the pediatric population face additional issues. That is the ones that is really related to their lifestyle, that, put them at risk and they don't control, that I mentioned before. And this has been overlooked because we said, whatever we do with celiac disease in adults, we will extrapolate automatically in kids and we're done. That's not a way. It really needs to customize when we talk about indication, inclusion criteria, rational to go for clinical trial in pediatrics. Also, because besides the birthday parties, these kids, they, school and lunch, and so on and so forth, it's really for peer pressure. I don't know if you remember, some of you maybe more freshly than I do because it was a while ago myself, but your goal is to blend. You don't want to look different. And therefore, and I can go for anecdotes during discussion, what the peer pressure can do to you in sticking with the program to comply with the gluten-free diet. Of course, there is the lack of appreciation of long-term consequences. This part of the frontal lobe, it doesn't mature until 17, 18. That's the one that tells you where are the long-term consequences of your behavior today. And finally, of course, the college and so on and so forth. Where we stand now in clinical trials, this was unthinkable in 2015. But you know, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, there are 260 of them, of which the one that are interventional that we really care is 180. So a lot of clinical trials that's going on everywhere in the world, mostly in Europe and the United States, but not exclusively. In the United States, there are a lot of places, particularly East and West Coast, in which we have a very active pipeline of clinical trials. And again, I want to make sure that, am I still on time? You don't pay attention, so I talk for how long I want.
You've got a couple more minutes.
That's right, I'm not, but I want to make sure that you pay attention to this. So this is the breakdown of where we are in the different phases. And this is extremely important when we talk about, you know, trials in pediatrics. There are several that, of course, are early stage, particularly early phase 1 or phase 1. These are the ones that typically will require a gluten challenge. Why? Because we take advantage of the possibility we can turn it off and on at will, the inflammatory process. And we can answer specific questions in terms of diagnostic targets and therapeutic targets. So these are the ones that would not be necessary to do anymore. Not in pediatrics, because this work will be done by the time that this clinical trial in adults will answer those questions, because the mechanisms are the same, the details may be different, so no need, in my humble opinion, to do a gluten challenge, you know, in pediatrics. If indeed one of these drugs, and I take out if, when one of these drugs will hit the market, so final will be approved for, you know, use in adults, automatically the FDA will accept clinical trial in pediatrics that will start from phase 2. Phase 2 is the real world, the 200 out of 1,000 that will not respond to the strict gluten-free diet despite the good compliance. And of course, the same for phase 3. So in my humble opinion, this is the landscape that you are looking at. And now, last slide. This is the last, you know, grade. There was grade 6. Look how totally they changed their mind. The goals today in workshop is to discuss the overall approach to drug development in celiac disease that includes an assessment of both clinical symptom and histology. That's repeating what they were doing in 2015. The workshop will focus the discussion on the histological endpoints to assess treatment benefit in patients with celiac disease. That was also an object discussion in 2015. Regulatory framework for pediatric drug development in celiac disease and the role of gluten challenge in clinical trials to provide a forum for open discussion between stakeholders to facilitate drug development. That was not even in the radar screen of 2015. Bottom line is not if, it's when we will have clinical trials in pediatrics that would better prepare, you know, all the stakeholders how we can approach this so that we can do this in a safe, appropriate way, because, you know, pediatrics by definition is a vulnerable population. And also, again, as I was reminded by Emmy, these are not little adults. These are different kind of biology, you know, developmental, you know, challenge and so on and so forth that needs to be taken into consideration when you start to think about designing clinical trial in pediatrics. Enough. I finished 38 seconds early.
Right on time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fasano. That was amazing. I will now turn the microphone over to Dr. Shayna Coburn for her presentation. Thank you.
I'm prepared with a timer just for that reason, because I don't want to go too far. I want to make sure we have a chance to all talk about what we're here to discuss today. So I'm really here with the goal of representing the patient voice from the research side of things, as well as kind of the clinician's perspective. So opening up the conversation to then be able to discuss it a little bit more, and emphasizing to kind of continue beyond what Dr. Fasano was just able to introduce about clinical trials, and also what so many of our presenters today have been able to already touch on, the importance of quality of life and asking people how they're feeling as part of clinical trials for children. So I have no disclosures other than the fact that this is my first in-person anything presenting in many years. So hopefully I still remember how to do it, but it's nice to have such a supportive environment here. But really, I'd like us to revisit a little bit of the question that many of us have heard many times. Why isn't the gluten-free diet good enough? Dr. Fasano was just able to talk quite a bit about some of the physical consequences of attempting the gluten-free diet and how difficult it is to maintain it. But also from a quality of life and psychosocial standpoint, there are considerations for us to think about as well. First, just for context, children with celiac disease are at an increased risk of having mental health disorders, emotional distress, and poor quality of life. And this really occurs at multiple different times at the point of diagnosis, beforehand and afterwards. And caregivers also struggle. So in the case of children, this is predominantly parents, and mothers disproportionately take on this caregiving role, especially when you're talking about a chronic illness, and this is the case in celiac disease as well. So not only are children impacted, but the entire family unit is impacted by a diagnosis of celiac disease and its lifelong management. We have found that as many as half of children coming to a celiac disease clinic like ours need some kind of psychological support. We've found that that is really the case regardless of the time since they were diagnosed. So the new diagnosis, maybe in the first 3 months of the time period, all the way up through many, many years, we have found that there's this chronic need for additional support, and a very small proportion who actually have received it by the time they get to our clinic. Another important point to consider is that being careful with the gluten-free diet, being vigilant, doing everything that the doctors are suggesting that we do, it can make life feel harder. Now, we don't have enough data to really know exactly how it impacts the family unit, but we do have evidence there that it can be extremely impactful on quality of life. So there's this trade-off of, if I'm really careful and I'm potentially physically healthier because of it, I might still be suffering in other ways. I may have a more limited life experience in some way or another. So something that we like to refer to that you may have heard about is the biopsychosocial model of health. And really this is just going beyond the biological considerations that might be in kind of the traditional model of health to think about psychological and social factors as well. So what your temperament and your personality is like, what your support system is like, what your environment is like, all of these different factors play a role in your overall health and well-being. So this is one way that we kind of like to think about it, almost this continuum of experiencing celiac disease. Before you've actually been diagnosed with celiac and it's not treated yet, at the point of diagnosis, and then beyond into that lifelong management. And there are a number of factors that pile up for people potentially at many different stages. This can have a really significant impact on their life, right? Not only are you potentially genetically predisposed to some more difficulties and mental health challenges and stress, but in addition, you have that major life change of the gluten-free diet and then adjusting to that over time. For children, we also have all of the developmental transitions that are continuously changing year by year throughout childhood and into adulthood. So, kind of coming back to what we're here for right now, what we want to know when we have a clinical trial is, does a treatment work, right? So how do we find that out? Obviously, there are some metrics in terms of the biological measurements of, the different things that I am not able to really give details on with, the epithelial cells and the really nitty-gritty biological aspects of disease. But there's also the patient experience. And so we talk about this oftentimes as patient-reported outcomes or PRO measures. This is really just asking people, how are you feeling? And if you're feeling better with the treatment, especially in comparison to people on a placebo or however they're being compared, that may mean that the treatment is working. So this is now something that is deemed necessary in clinical trials. Not only can we have biological metrics, but we need to also have PROs to actually make sure that the patients undergoing the treatment are feeling better and getting better. So the FDA has guidance on this. This is one kind of helpful but very complicated diagram of the process of developing a PRO measure. But essentially, the really important piece here is to over and over again go back to the patients, go back to the people who know about this best, to ask them, are we doing this right? Does this make sense to you? Is this capturing what we think it's capturing? And then there's psychometric testing to be done as well to make sure that it's reliably measuring these things and then it's able to detect change over time so that if you start feeling better, that this measure can show that. So in pediatric celiac disease, how do we answer that question of do you feel better using kind of a PRO? Well, there's the big debate about who do we ask. In children, they may or may not be reliable at being able to describe their experience. Parents can be a really valuable reporter for this, and they have their own perspective that can be very useful here. But the child is the expert of their own body, so they also need to be asked. There are different perspectives depending on the FDA and other guidance about the best way to assess these kinds of outcomes. My argument is definitely that you probably need them all, and they need to converge in order to get the most realistic perspective. We also need to measure what. What is getting better? What do we care about? The physical symptoms are the clearest starting point, right? How are those in terms of frequency, how severe they are, how much they impact your life, what kinds of reactions occur. But then what about people, for instance, in celiac who are asymptomatic? Or what about people who are extremely, extremely careful or hypervigilant, where they're extra careful, maybe beyond what they even need to do? That might really negatively impact their life, even if they're physically doing okay managing the diet. So quality of life, essentially how you are able to live your life, is a really helpful solution to this to capture more about the patient experience. It helps us understand the burden of the diet, the stigma, fears of reactions, all the different aspects of daily life and just the experience of living with celiac disease and its treatment. So really briefly, I want to introduce an example outcome measure that we're currently working on. It has a brand new name. Hopefully no one has used it before, but the Celiac Disease Life Inventory of Family Experiences, or the CD Life. We've basically used the procedures recommended to iteratively or kind of over and over again ask people to make sure that we're having the best possible measure. So we engaged in qualitative interviews with parents and their children. We refined and developed questions and an item bank. Then we returned back to additional patients and children and their parents, as well as clinician experts, to get additional feedback and make sure we're really measuring what we want to. And then once we refined that, we ended up with an item bank that now is undergoing psychometric validation. So we've collected all of our data, but the results are pending, so I can't tell you exactly what the measure will be just yet, but hopefully in the next couple months we'll have more information about that. But generally, the CD Life will be capturing the parent and the child report if the child is 8 years or older, and it should be able to allow us to capture their experiences across the childhood period. Right now we have 37 items that we're testing. We're hoping to get it to 20 to 25 items. So essentially it would be a brief screening survey that people could complete relatively easily. And then some of the sample questions that we have in the item bank that may or may not end up in the final one, things like, it is hard for my family to eat outside my home or travel because of celiac disease. I get jealous of what other people are eating when I cannot eat it. My timer's telling me I need to stop soon. I'm afraid of getting sick from gluten, or I'm comfortable explaining my celiac disease to others. We have a number of different domains that we see as really necessary to be capturing for this. So take-home messages. The gluten-free diet carries burdens in a number of different ways, not only physically, but, and as I've been so pleased to hear so many people talk about today, quality of life and the overall experience as well. People with celiac disease are also vulnerable to mental health struggles, which really needs to be emphasized and captured as well. And PRO measures, patient-reported outcomes, are really important in clinical trials, but we don't really have them for children just yet. So there's more hopefully coming down the pipeline, but there's still more to be done. And I'll be sure to communicate to the public as quickly as we can if we do have this measure, validated and available. So that's just something for us to kind of think about as we talk through all of this on our panel. And just briefly, I wanted to mention all of the people involved with different work that we're doing. Feel free to follow us on social media. I'm involved with a group that's really trying to connect the public with behavioral science and celiac disease.
All right, thank you, Dr. Coburn. That was fantastic. So I'm going to open up with just a couple questions, actually, for our patient representatives, and then we'll go through some questions I have drawn up, and then I'll open up to the audience as well. So the first question I had was for Jaime, and the question is, how would you feel about having your son Aiden involved in a clinical trial? What concerns would you have? Would you feel comfortable having him in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so to be honest, before being here and listening to everybody speak, I was somewhat hesitant on having Aiden participate in a clinical trial, but seeing what goes on behind the scenes and how many very intelligent people are working together for these clinical trials, it put my mind at ease a little bit. I believe, I'm not as familiar with clinical trials, but the phases, as far as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 1 being a safety phase to make sure it's safe, I don't think I would ever put him on a clinical trial in phase 1, but I believe it was mentioned that phase 1 they were getting rid of that for pediatric clinical trials. So having said that, I am definitely more open to have him participate in a clinical trial.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll turn the question over to Aiden as well, as someone who would be the one participating in that clinical trial. What are your thoughts? Would you be comfortable with that? What concerns would you have?
I think I would like to be in a clinical trial because eating gluten, if I can eat gluten, I'm all for it.
Would you have any concerns about being, I know as Dr. Fasano said, potentially moving forward they could phase out for the pediatric population needing to have that gluten challenge and going right to the later stages. Would you have any concerns about being involved in that, in the trial of these medications?
No, I don't think I would have any concerns.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then kind of turning the question over to our medical experts, have you heard similar sentiments from your patients? Have you heard other concerns that you would want to share with our group today?
Well, again, we see a fair amount of patients that systematically ask when you guys put your act together and give something to my son or my daughter. So there is a huge expectation there. But, again, the stuff like clinical trials designed and done in a certain way for a reason. The Latin said primum non nocere, so the first thing is you don't want to harm. And therefore, that's the rationale why any drug that is evaluated for any given indication is given to adults first. Again, why you can't extrapolate, exactly from adults to pediatrics, but the safety signal is very telling and predicts what's going to happen in pediatrics. Let me clarify one thing. It's not that the scientific community decided to give up with phase 1 in pediatrics. That is my opinion. I would not suggest to do something like this because that would be more to have an appreciation in phase 1 with the gluten challenge. It's safety, but also to understand, am I going to the right path? I'm going after the right, therapeutic target. That question must be answered already when this trial is mature for clinical trial in pediatrics. Even in phase 3, there is still safety signal that are checked. It's not that you do safety phase 1 and then phase 2 and 3 are only efficacy. So the safety is always, recorded toward, no matter what kind of, trial stage you are in.
Yeah, and I think that there's a really big range of perspectives that people have. Absolutely, that one of the challenges is that parents, of course, are concerned about safety for their child. And they want potential benefit. And I think another challenge, too, is sometimes if there's placebo groups or other questions about, well, will they even get that potentially great treatment, or are we just doing this out of the goodness of our hearts, or to advance this? I think that also can be a difficult decision for parents. I think for kids, it depends on their experience. There's kind of a group of people who are perfectly happy doing the gluten-free diet, and their family makes it and maybe sometimes their environment, right, when we talk about the biopsychosocial model, maybe their environment is very supportive of the gluten-free diet, and they kind of talk about how it's really not a big deal. And I will say I've heard that more in the last several years, and actually we didn't talk about this yet, but with the pandemic, a lot of people actually felt like it made their environment more controlled. And so I would say right now there are definitely some, especially children, who would say like, well, there's no big deal. I don't know that I care that much because I can just do the gluten-free diet. It's fine. But there's absolutely another large chunk of people who talk about the symptoms, getting exposed, continuing to feel sick, being scared of being exposed, where if there's a treatment that would allow their life to be a little bit easier and let them go out and do things and be part of the activities that everybody else are part of, I think that is very appealing for many people.
Thank you. I know we've touched on this a little bit about the discussion of, in a lot of these trials in celiac disease, having a gluten challenge is a portion of that. And I think you started to touch upon this a little bit, Jamie, but would there ever be a situation where you would feel comfortable having Aiden undergo a gluten challenge for one of these trials if it was required? Or is that something that would be an automatic reason not to involve him in that trial?
I definitely, if you ask Aiden, if I said no, he could not do the gluten challenge, he would hate me. So I don't think I would have a problem with him doing the gluten challenge. I don't know that he has a horrible side effect when he does eat gluten. I believe he unintentionally ate gluten some years ago where he had an excruciating headache that he could not get rid of for hours. So personally, and I don't want the pain for him, so that would make me a little hesitant. But him knowing that, he's in control and he can take medicine, I think I would be okay with putting him through a gluten challenge.
Thank you. And Aiden, what are your thoughts on having to undergo, if that was the case, a gluten challenge for part of these trials?
I think a gluten challenge would be a great idea.
Thank you. All right. The next question is more targeted for Dr. Fasano and Dr. Coburn. But what issues do you see in the recruitment and retainment of patients in pediatric clinical trials as compared to adult clinical trials?
So, as kids are not like adults, not all kids are equal depending on the age. Aiden, how old are you?
I'm 15.
15, okay. So he's already in the category of the teenager kids. Recruiting teenagers would not be, I believe, a great challenge. If they ask, and you heard firsthand, so he's represented this, I need to shoot the drug in your brain so you can eat gluten. They will say, absolutely, no problem. I don't have a problem with that because they really want to blend. They don't want to be different. They want to go out and have a pizza with somebody and not being, single out. You ask to a kid that is 5 years old, he or she will say, talk with mom because, he know better. And there I can see, eventually the difference in accepting, a gluten challenge or not. I think that universally, everybody wants to see something in pediatrics. Recruitment is not a big deal if you, again, like for the COVID vaccine, you start with the older kids first, and then you see safety signal there. You go with the younger kids and so on and so forth. Retention depends on what kind of, and recruitment also depends on the study design. If you do a trial that you will require 5 biopsies, 5 endoscopies, will be different from one that will require none. Retention is always related to how complex is the study design, how many times I have to come to the hospital to do that. And of course, you heard, great testimony of communication. If you communicate clearly the results in terms of what can be shared in a blinded study, as there will be, ultimately, I think that, again, this boils down to make a study design that is defendable and implementable in pediatrics. When we do this in adults right now, we have 4 clinical trials up and running at our center. Some of them will require 3 endoscopies, 2 video capsule endoscopies, and 15, 20 biopsies of each endoscopy. This is unthinkable in pediatrics. You can't do that. But because we are trying to answer specific questions, am I barking the right tree? Am I using this repurposed drug in the right way? And so on and so forth. Again, I want to assume, as an advocate for the pediatric population, that all these questions are answered. The guinea pig adults have been doing this, and now we capitalize for the pediatric population, which you can really design something that is sustainable and feasible, both in terms of recruitment and retention in this pediatric population.
Great, thank you. Dr. Coburn, did you want to add anything to that?
I think the one other consideration I would just add is that when we're enrolling people, recruiting them, and then also trying to maintain them in our study, or in any studies, right? We have to get permission from the parents and the child. And so it's an added layer of cooperation and agreement at every stage of the study. It's not just asking the person who's going to experience the actual treatment or biopsies or whatever might be happening. It's not just asking them if they're on board, but it's also getting the parents on board and to give their permission. And for them to set aside the time and the energy to participate however that may need to look. So from a logistics standpoint, it's more complicated for the researchers, but also for the families who are participating. And I think that, as people have talked about with the communication, persistence in just continuing to talk with people, making sure they understand what it is that they're getting into, but also maybe making sure that anything they're afraid of or worried about is talked through is really important, because then you're getting people who really are informed and are on board with the entire study and are enthusiastic about it, and then you're going to keep people more easily. So I think that's the other challenge with pediatrics, just that it's not just a matter of reaching the one patient and making them sign and follow up, but it's really potentially affecting the whole family.
Great, thank you. And so you just touched upon one difference, obviously, in pediatric clinical trials is not only do you need the consent, but you need the assent of the pediatric patient as well. Are either of you able to touch upon other regulatory and ethical issues that are specific to pediatrics versus adults that vary in the two groups?
Again, pediatrics is by default considered a vulnerable population and has all different sets of rules to protect them. So, it's a family affair, but if one part of the family has one opinion versus another, the regulator will favor the child's point of view. If, making this crazy example, mom said, I think that you should do that. And he said, I don't want to do this because I have to, poop in a cup and I don't want to do it. That needs to be respected and can be, because coercion is, and parental influence, it's a big deal. the legislator really wants to make sure that being a vulnerable population, the kids will be heard in his or her opinion to participate or not in a trial.
I just wanted to add, I think that education is crucial when trying to get people to do clinical trials, especially for the parents, because most people, at least I did, when I hear clinical trials, I think lab rat, and I don't want my child to be a quote-unquote lab rat. So the education just that I've gotten here today is huge and crucial to get people to sign on for clinical trials.
Excellent, thank you. Did you want to add anything, Dr. Coburn?
Just one thing that's coming up as you mentioned that, I think, is just the importance of involving families throughout the process. And I think that different groups of people do this, researchers do this to varying degrees of success, but the more you're able to go talk to some families and have them help partner with you to develop treatments, make sure it's relevant to them, and to then figure out how to find participants and educate them on the things that they might be concerned about, that is really the best recipe for success. And I think that research in general is just maybe not, in terms of regulations and ethics and all of that, not consistently guided in that direction, and there's probably more we could do to make sure that that's happening more consistently for everybody, and that would probably lead to more success down the road.
Wonderful. So this will be my last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience if anyone has any additional questions. But I know towards the end of your presentation, Dr. Fasano, you had mentioned that there's more behavioral factors that you need to consider when doing a pediatric clinical trial. Can you touch a little bit more upon that and the differences in the behavioral and biological factors that may cause a clinical trial in children to vary from adults?
Yeah, I mean, again, we have several experience what we call observational trials. It's not that they've never been done a clinical trial in pediatrics. The observation trial is when you do something in a study design in which you don't do a drug intervention, but they still clinical trial. So we learn a great deal with our CDGEM study that now is in its 10th year. And again, you see how you go from a neonate to a 6, 7 years old kid, how this evolves, and what he or her opinion, you really, mature toward, the project. And again, was eloquently said before, you are not a guinea pig or an animal experiments, because these people, they took ownership. We have, chat room that we are not allowed from the parents of the CDGEM, family, that, again, will face some of this psychological, hurdle to stay in the program. We have 80% in a 10 years old trial. It's unprecedented. Not only we send the birthday card and we send, the results and so on and so forth, we invite these kids on campus to visit, the labs where the poop is saved. They have their own lab coats, so they have a ceremonial lab coats, when they come over. And again, they, every single time that something is published, they receive news. That psychologically engage the kids that will create the sense that CDGEM is part of my life. It's not that I'm doing a trial. Of course, I can't extrapolate this to a short interventional trial, but, as you heard, educate me, let me understand what is your goal. Then I have a different psychological attitude toward what I'm doing. The time in which, even in terms of healthcare, I, doctor, impose to you patients my, treatment, and you shut up and just do it, is gone. And thankfully so, because everybody thanks also to, the possibility of easy access to information. We take ownership of our health. We want to be part of it. The key element, and I'll finish here, is the communication is to be based on factual information, and fake news, particularly in the healthcare domain, are, out there at the wazoo. And education also will allow you to distinguish facts from, junk.
Would anyone else on the panel like to make comments on that topic?
What was the question again?
It was how the biological and psychological aspects of dealing with children vary from that of adults, and what special factors you may need to take into account.
You know, I think that sort of like I mentioned, the different developmental stage of the child matters a lot, and I think in healthcare sometimes it can be forgotten that, you know, the child really needs to understand what's going to be happening in their terms, and that they can be asked permission at any age, you know, if they are, and give them a little bit of the control for whatever might be going on. So I think that is really important. And then from the parent perspective, I would say, you know, kind of just lots and lots of contact and reminders is super important. I actually have participated in some studies myself just because I'm an enthusiast about research. And I am the first to say it took many reminders to sometimes complete surveys and other things as part of research that I was participating in. And so I find that with my research staff, I often have to encourage them to reach out more and more and more and say, you know, these people participants always have the option to opt out, and we make it clear how they can do that. But we're going to keep reminding them, because if they signed up, they probably intend to participate. It's just really hard. There's a lot going on in their lives. And so making sure we're at the forefront of people's minds when we're participating in research makes all the difference in the world. And then the last thing I would say is just respecting everyone's time. So making sure that we compensate people when they are putting in a lot of time and effort, or undergoing procedures, or eating gluten and feeling sick, whatever it might be, you know, just making sure that we do something to try to help show our gratitude as researchers for families to help them. And sometimes thinking about that with the children as well. It's maybe we don't pay the parents, maybe we pay the children, or maybe it's both, but, you know, maybe we don't just only send a gift card to the parent and say, work it out with your child, right? I think just respecting everyone involved makes a big difference.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to turn the questions over to the audience. If anyone has some questions they'd like to pose to the panel.
Hi, thank you. So thanks to everyone on the panel. This has been great. My question is a natural segue from what you were just talking about, which is, I think everyone would agree, whether you have celiac or not, or a caregiver, that we would love an alternate therapeutic intervention besides the gluten-free diet. And the challenge is getting people into studies, and whether you're a parent with your child enrolling or an adult. So and you've touched a little on this, any thought to some innovative ways to incentivize participation? And I love everything that you all talked about, making it a part of your life, that this is, you know, something I do, a place I go, this is what I do. I wonder, has anyone thought creatively for additional things that might be of value to the community that they don't necessarily have access to beyond financial reimbursement or things along those lines?
I mean, I can speak to
a cruise. Celiac cruise.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to the experience of kind of asking people about their life and their overall well-being. People will thank us for asking them, which is kind of a shock. And it's been interesting talking to some of my physician colleagues when we first started doing more psychological research. Physicians sometimes were actually really worried that we were going to upset participants by asking them about how they're doing. And I think, you know, sometimes people find it, I don't want to say they find it therapeutic necessarily, but to just reflect on and be able to share what it is that they're going through and what that's like for them sometimes is actually really motivating. But I think also COVID has made us have to really shift a little bit about how we approach trying to find people. And I think it's given us more innovative ways to not just stick to, okay, within our healthcare clinic, we'll recruit people, you know, instead we're gonna go looking everywhere for where people are. But I think we have a long way to go to really make it appealing and help people feel like part of it consistently. I think like CDGEM is an exception to a lot of the other studies out there that might not necessarily do as much and give as much feedback.
So there is a lot of attention about economical rewarding in pediatric trials because the legislator is afraid that this is a coercion, particularly in certain age groups. There are kids that even to have the money to buy a video game will do anything. Just cut my arm, that's fine. So we got to be very careful of that. But, you know, I probably the best incentive, and again, this depends on which span, the lifespan you're talking about, is the return on investment. And I probably, if I have 30 seconds, I tell you an episode of a patient. This is real. This fellow that was, I believe it was 16 when he was diagnosed with symptoms all 9 yards, went on a gluten-free diet, the symptoms resolved, he was doing great, and then a follow-up, he came and was not doing great. The antibodies were up, his weight was not, you know, maintaining, actually was losing weight. Asked, are you strictly gluten-free? He said, absolutely yes. We went on and on and on, and we couldn't find what was wrong. And then I asked, you know, the parents to leave the room, and I said, you know, I'm not here to patronize you. I just need to know if there is anything else that I need to be concerned, or, you know, because this can be a big deal if you're losing weight. And he said, well, to be totally honest with you, a few months ago, I met a girl, and we went out for a date. And she asked for pizza, and I felt uncomfortable to order something else. I had the pizza, I didn't have any symptoms. So the date went well, and we went out again, and, I felt that I may order whatever I want. And until eventually I start to have the symptoms, and now I'm really stuck. What can I tell her? You know, I can't just go back. I wish that I had a pill. That's his words. That will eventually allow me to, you know, eat out there and not having this embarrassing situation, to then stay gluten-free, that I'm okay. So anyhow, this is to say, see, this is a scenario in which the incentive is to, once again, blend with your peers. That can be very different age. So it's not a simple matter, because pediatrics is such a fascinating, realm of possibilities, because when you say pediatrics, you talk about the neonate, you talk about the toddler, you could talk about, a child, a pre-teenager, a teenager, and a young adult. That makes it a little bit more complicated. That's the reason why I said, if I was a CSO or CMO of a company, I would go first with the older, group of individuals. I know how to incentivize those, and once I go through that hurdle, then I move backward edgewise.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions and then go to our break.
I hate to mention cystic fibrosis again, but I want to tell you a little bit how we were able to incentivize our patients, but it was incentivized on the back end of the clinical trial, because all the patients were assured whether they were, every person has, suppose I'm on placebo, but at the end of the part of the trial, everybody rolled over to drug. So everybody was assured they were going to have some drug. And then at the end of the trial, of course, this is all involves discussions with your Data Safety Monitoring Committee and the FDA. Everybody, and if it was shown to be efficacy, everybody got the drug till it was approved. So this was first in line. And that was, we didn't have problems with, because we did know mostly, the patients were talking, because they knew it was efficacy, and that all depends on efficacy. But that's a good way to assure on the back end, and I hope it's still legal, but I know there's a lot of discussion. And that's really important for the pharmaceutical companies here, because they ought to think about the design of their clinical trials so that they can talk to the patients and encourage them that they can move, they will get drug if it's efficacious, to the time it's approved, so there will be no discontinuance of the drug study.
It's not just legal, it's allowed. Actually, in pediatrics, it's allowed in the safety monitoring board has been blessed, you know, in monitoring this, that you, during the consent form, say, you will be randomized blindly in a placebo or, you know, drug. If the drug at the end, when the blood is broken, show efficacy and you were in the placebo arm, you will be allowed in an open label approach to receive the drug. It's allowed. It's absolutely, because otherwise, indeed, particularly in pediatrics, that I put my child through all this and maybe in the wrong arm, I will not have a return on investment. So that's
it's really important that the patients
absolutely
know this up front.
Absolutely.
Because
it's in the consent form.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
All right, should we take one more question? And then we'll turn over to the break.
Thank you very much. I had a question for Aiden and his mom. One of the things we do when we do research is we not only have to get money to get it funded, but we also have ethics boards, as Dr. Fasano was mentioning, who review it. And I've recently been in extended discussions with our ethics board about returning results to participants. And so when we do a clinical trial, we often do tests like a TTG where it's approved and we know, and sometimes we do another test that's not approved. How important is it to you to get the results of your tests from the study? Not just the ones like the biopsy where we already know, but if we do something special on the biopsy, how much of your results do you want?
Were you asking me or Aiden? Did you say Aiden's mom?
Both of you.
Okay. I mean, I think it's very important to know the results of all the tests. Of course, I don't need to physically see the results because I won't understand what I'm looking at, but to be explained what came out of any and all tests that were done on Aiden, I would definitely want to hear about all those results. You had mentioned about something that was approved and something that wasn't approved. What do you mean by that?
So there's a process that tests have to go through to be allowed to be a clinical test. And when we do research studies, often we're doing research tests that haven't gone through that process to be proven. And so it's different for us to give you the results of a proven test than an unproven test. And so I wonder if you want all of it or how you feel about getting results of unproven tests.
Got it. Yeah, I think I would still want all of the results just to make it a big picture, whether they be approved or not.
Me too.
All right, well, thank you, panel.
Thanks for your thoughts. It's so